Hey guys, we're going to start our new unit today in Social Studies. It actually is from 1975 all the way to about 2001. So you'll be able to see things posted each day. Today, if you look at the screen here, I pulled up the doodle notes. You certainly will not need these unless you have a printer and you want to print them out. All I'm asking you guys to do is kind of jot down an idea for each section. So you can look at my video here, and then I've also linked so you can go back to the slides and find one idea. So there's 8 sections, a total of like 8 sentences is all you need. Jot them in so that you have them. So if you take a look here with the PowerPoint slides, I'm going to go through some of the ideas. With this, we'll move this. Really, if you talk about communism, after World War II, the Soviet Union kind of had a weakened military and their economy following World War II. There was actually a boost when from the communism, and it actually worked a little bit right away after World War II. But the problem is it really couldn't last. The economic system of communism could not compete on like a global scale with the rest of the world, and so compared to many of the countries in the world, especially like the U.S. with their capitalism, communism was not very successful and could not compete. So if you take a look here, there are the countries. I have a map coming up that I'll show you. Really, I can pull that up right now. If you take a look, these are the map. This is the map of all the countries that are connected that were the Soviet Union here. So you can see, Ukraine, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, Serbia. All of these countries were actually tied into Russia as the Soviet Union. And this is during this time period in the 1980s that we'll study, where many of them tried to begin breaking away from Russia. And so going back to our slides here, really this was a time where citizens wanted to start fresh and break away from the Soviet Union, break away from Russia. And so the problem was they didn't have freedom. They weren't allowed freedom of speech, press, religion, all the things that we have in our country. They didn't have these freedoms. And so they could only, you could see on the slide, read and listen to what the government allowed them to do. So this made it very hard to fight back against the government or rebel or ask for freedom. So when the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev came into power, he decided to try to make some changes and kind of compromise. And so he allowed citizens to start having freedom of speech. And he tried to build up the economy and make things stronger and better so they can compete on a world scale. The problem is here is once he gave that freedom of speech, many of the countries and the citizens started to demand for independence, and they now had the freedom to at least say those things without being thrown in jail or having any issues. And so if you look, the 15 different countries that I showed you on the map, they started, many of them, to push back and try to break away. Poland started this. In 1980, they tried to start a revolution and a resistance to the Soviet Union. And so if you look after Poland in 1989, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they all began to revolt. You see really military-wise, some of these countries had military in place, but it was all controlled essentially together as the Soviet Union. But once they had some of these freedoms just a little bit, they started to break away. In East Germany, it says something incredible happened. The wall was broken down, at least part of it. They started to open up the wall, and it says, large protests began happening in the streets, and people said, okay, we want this wall torn down. Eventually, you can see from the headlines that people started to just go to the wall and start to break it apart and tear it down. The wall itself, remember, was kind of a symbolic of communism and symbolic of the Cold War and the war between really the Soviet Union, communism, and the rest of the Western part of the world, that had more capitalist ideas and democratic ideas. And so once this wall was broken apart, it started to signal the end of communism and how things were with, you had the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. And so once this wall started to be broken down and collapse, it did show that things were changing in our world. If you look at these slides, you can see people just taking turns, destroying the wall, bringing it down. All these people here, it was a big celebration that, okay, we're heading more towards freedom here. And so there was a lot of hope and excitement. And so it says, no more Iron Curtain. It came down by 1992. All these countries that had rebelled were successful. The Soviet Union basically was no more. It collapsed, and all these countries in blue were able to break away. And so, once again, if you see this map, all these different 15 independent republics, they became their own countries that were separated and started their own government, and many of them tried to break away from communism and that idea and start some new things. Really part of this, a really big factor, was our president in the United States, Ronald Reagan. He actually was an actor in the 1950s and 1960s, really actually quite famous. And he retired from acting in 1965, and in 1966 was actually elected governor of California and did stuff in politics all the way into, in 1980, he was elected president of the United States. And so he had 2 terms, 1980 and 1984. He served as president of the United States. So he felt very strongly that the Soviets and communism needed to stop. And so he put some pressure on them. And remember, we still had the arms race and built up quite a bit of weapons, and the Soviet Union could not continue to keep up because their economy was so weak that they were still putting way too much money into the nuclear race and the arms race that they didn't have enough money devoted towards the citizens and the people, which caused even more problems. Reagan tried to convince the Soviets that they need to get rid of some of these missiles and disarm and kind of focus less on the Cold War and focus less on the tension between the two countries. And what's funny, like this slide is hilarious to me, it said Reagan also wanted the U.S. to research satellites that could shoot down Soviet missiles from space using ray beams. There was no technology like this. Certainly in movies you see this, but even today that doesn't even seem realistic. But we really were brainstorming with all the increase of technology, what could we do and how could we use that to benefit us in our protection of our country. So there's still not laser beam shot from space, but it's a pretty cool idea. So maybe he could make a movie about that. Unfortunately, he's not with us anymore. So he started to, it says, turn up the heat, and this was actually, you could see the picture of them two, the two of them, Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, meeting here. And once again, the focus was on disarming and getting rid of these weapons. The citizens here said, listen, we need money for ourselves. We're poor, the economy is in shambles, and we demand better conditions. And so you could see all the protests that keep happening in Europe and in the Soviet Union, in the Eastern Europe. This is really a very important point in history. This is a famous speech where Ronald Reagan says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, saying we need to tear down the Berlin Wall. So we talked about how it was torn down, but it wasn't until the very late 1980s that this happened. So throughout this decade, pressure was put more and more on the Soviet Union. I have a quick little clip of this speech. It's very famous. This is just the famous quote here.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.